Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unwelcome Access Podcast. As always, my name is Ross Edelstein, and I will be your host. And this month is Disability Pride Month. It is July. I'm recording this on the 4th of July, and honestly, given recent events in 2025, I thought, what better way to use the power of this podcast than to highlight the ways that the disability rights movement has really been a powerful force in the US, and the ways that that work really exemplifies the best of America. Now, that being said, this is a look at the history that led us to where we are today with the disability rights movement and disability pride in general. Now, on the screen, you have the disability pride flag, which is a slanted to the bottom right from the top left set of stripes in a muted green, blue, white, yellow, and red with a black background, all of which is very saturated. This is the disability pride flag. You might have seen a zigzag version. I'm not going to put it on the screen, but it's basically the same thing without the saturation and in a sort of lightning stripe configuration that turns out that was causing folks to have some issues, causing seizures in particular. And so the disability pride flag that we use today, the one on the screen, was born to mitigate that while still keeping a lot of the same central meaning. This is a incredibly important topic, as this really is looking at how we got here. Now, I also want to say, for a lot of this, I highly recommend you go and watch CRIP Camp. I am relaying a lot of the same stories, and CRIP Camp has the people who were actually there. That being said, I am going to add some other context and look at things more broadly. And I'm also going to approach this a little bit more academically than CRIP Camp does, so hopefully this is a complementary recording. That said, let's get into story time with Ross. Now, this story time with Ross is going to be about when I became the designated disabled person for the screening of CRIP Camp at my university. Now, I was asked by a professor of mine who had been asked to come and be the one to speak. Now, my professor is not disabled in any way, and as really in my program, special education, the only really openly disabled person there, I was, to his mind, the perfect choice. And I will agree, I was. But it wasn't intended to be tokenism, as it might come across. It was genuinely, hey, I don't feel comfortable being a non-disabled person as the only one speaking on this. Please come and do this. I hadn't watched CRIP Camp to this point. Now, I will include a link to it in the description, and if nothing else, go and watch it, listen to the people who were actually there, because a lot of that is related. But it was an eye-opening experience, specifically looking at some of the points around the development of the movement and how a lot of how it developed was those personal connections becoming greater than the whole, which is something that is a recurring theme with disability rights. Nothing about us without us isn't nothing about us without me, right? That said, on the screen, I want to set the scene. And here we have 4 disabled people, all chair users, protesting in front of a bus. There are 4 different signs. There is the person on the left has a sign that says, "It's illegal," and a dog of a policy. The next person from left to right has a sign, "Lifts, not lies," and these first 2 people have their signs taped to themselves or their chairs. Actually, all of them have them taped or in the case of one person on a string around their neck. The person to the sort of third from the left has a sign that says Freedom Rider, and the person on the far right has a sign that says Buses Are For Everyone. Now, by my best guess, this is a pretty grainy photo. We have a man, and two white men, a white woman, and a black woman as the figures. And that is something that you're going to see a lot in these photos, of the intersectionality, something we discussed in the last episode on Pride 1. I make the joke often that Disability Pride is Pride 2 because it's a Pride Month immediately after a Pride Month. It's too good of a joke not to make in my mind. But this is something I wanted to use to set the scene, as we'll cover in a episode that will be coming out very soon. Transit was a huge area of advocacy. But to set the scene, I want to start with some topics I've covered before. So prior to sort of the disability rights movement coalescing, you had most disability treatment around asylums. And that really changes during the Great Depression. You have Social Security becoming the first sort of national social welfare program that allowed disabled people, and in particular ones who could not work, to get some sort of meager support to keep them alive. Now, keyword is meager. Social Security will be its own episode, but this is sort of the starting point of looking at it. Now, around the same time as the disability rights movement really catching on, you have ARC versus Pennsylvania. I'm not using the official name of this case because, well, the R in there is the R slur, and I am not going to use that in any way, shape, or form unless absolutely necessary, and it isn't here because it's the same organization as the ARC today. But this really kickstarts deinstitutionalization, particularly when you're looking at intellectual and developmental disabilities and neurodivergence, disabilities of mental health, and so on. This deinstitutionalization, or basically shutting down residential facilities, places where you live and get treatment, for a more community-based, aka you live in a house or apartment, way of looking at things, is one of the things that helps feed the disability rights movement, because you end up with a lot of people who now aren't sort of being segregated from society, and it is segregation, who now are coming into a world where, wait a moment, this is not okay. It's also the time of the civil rights movement, and looking at particularly black civil rights in the US. And you can see that the white woman, third from the left, has Freedom Rider on her sign, and that's intentional. The disability rights movement and the civil rights movement, as you'll see, have a lot of overlap. And the disability rights movement in particular drew a lot of tactics and a lot of inspiration from the civil rights movement. Now, I do want to scroll back a couple years. One of the things I talked about in the very first full episode, looking at sort of the general legislation that exists, is the Architectural Barriers Act. Now, this sort of became the basis for all of our various disability standards laws, but the Architectural Barriers Act actually is 1968. It's the first disability built environment law and really disability rights law in the US and really most of the world. And I say this in contrast with, say, a welfare or a social safety net type of law, something like universal health care, or looking at, say, disability payments. Those are separate things, because you can absolutely basically do the, how do I describe this meme? But basically the, hey, we'll give you some money if you go and shut up. Now, that being said, the Architectural Barriers Act only covered the feds, and it was far from complete. And again, it's early. it's also around the time we have what I have called JFK's Wild Ride. Now, I've also already done an episode on the Kennedys. Highly recommend you go and watch that, as that provides other context for a lot of these things. But JFK's Wild Ride really starts to look at the federal government being involved in disability. And it leads to the Rehab Acts, or the Rehabilitation Acts. Now, the Rehabilitation Acts cover, as I've discussed on, again, that first episode, far more than just, say, what you might think of as rehabilitation in a hospital. It's vocational rehab. It's how is the federal government going to provide support so that disabled people can participate in economic activity. Now, there are arguments to be made for and against this, but the Rehab Acts are where we get Section 504. Now, Section 504 is the non-discrimination bit, the part that specifically says, hey, the federal government and any contractors are not allowed to discriminate against disabled people, in just about as many words. That was slipped in the last moment. And that's really important to note, is that a lot of people didn't necessarily want Section 504 to be a thing, despite it being really a cornerstone of disability rights today. Now, on the screen, and I'm using a lot of historical photos in this episode, I will have the links to all of the places where I got the photos in the description, as well as in the PowerPoint slides, which you can find on my Patreon for free. No paywall, nothing like that. Easier to host it there. That said, the image on the screen is of the Black Panther. And I mean this as the specific news service. Well, it shows its age with the language used, right? And it specifically says, handicapped when demands, end HEW occupation. Now, for those who don't know, one, go watch CRIP Camp. I'm going to keep saying this entire episode. But HEW is Health, Education, and Welfare. This is, at the time, the name of what is now several departments: Health and Human Services, Housing Urban Development, Department of Education, and so on. And I chose the Black Panther, which is the newspaper of the Black Panthers, for a reason, and a few reasons. Specifically, the Black Panthers are an important part of that story, even if CRIP Camp only is able to give them a small amount of screen time. The Black Panthers were a revolutionary group that specifically looked at Black liberation, and by that, specifically countering the normalization of saying, hey, don't behave in a Black way, don't exist in a Black way, etc. Protecting Black communities, so on and so forth. And a lot of the same people who resisted 504 perpetuated a lot of the racism that the Black Panthers and their offshoots to this day have tried to combat. So a lot of corporations did not want to have to suddenly be accessible. A lot of landlords really didn't want to be accessible because, again, they didn't want to spend money. And people in power didn't want to have to change the way they thought about other people. Because for a lot of people in power, disabled people are thought of as an inconvenience. Oh, I now have to deal with this person who is different than me. And again, a lot of that money and power leads to the medical model. Well, if we just fix the person and force them to fix that themselves, well, they are not going to cause us an issue. And to reiterate on the medical model, it's the idea that the source of what causes barriers for somebody is their disability itself. So, for example, if you have a building that you only can use steps to get into, somebody who can't use steps, well, the barrier is that they can't use the steps. The social model says, well, there's no reason you couldn't have put a ramp here. The barrier is the choice of somebody else to not do that. And while most things fall in the middle, the medical model is really important to look at because the idea, again, especially with asylums, well, we have to fix these people before we can allow them to participate in society. And that transfers the onus of doing things onto the individual and not people in power. Now, a lot of this led to really weakening of proposed 504 regulations over time. Now, the Section 504 was originally signed into law in 1974. It was 1977 before regulations got signed, and we'll come to that story in a moment. But those weakening regulations over the years and sort of dragging your feet on them was a feature, not a bug. It was intentional because the goal was to wait out the resistance of the disability rights movement as it was developing. Now, even though 504 and non-discrimination was the law of the land, a lot of how you enforce that is regulation, which is, I'm an agency, I have a set of rules that guide what I do and how I do it, and create the processes and ways to address, say, a part of what we do. Now, every agency has their own 504 regulations. All of them are engaged and developed with the sort of central organization that's required to put them into practice. So in this case, Health, Education, and Welfare was the department tasked with developing 504 regulations that then everybody else would base theirs off of. So challenging the powers that be is the U.S. disability rights movement. Now, this photo is from a little bit later during the Capitol crawl, which we'll talk about in a moment, but it's a police van, the United States Capitol Police's van, and one of the few accessible ones that's been brought to arrest the protesters that were advocating for change. Now, coming up against the powers that be was the U.S. disability rights movement. Now, on the screen, we have a picture of the U.S. Capitol. This is from a little bit after the 504 sit-ins, and we'll talk about this incident, but this is from what is known as the Capitol Crawl. And so this is the U.S. Capitol building in the background with a Capitol Police van, also known as a quote-unquote paddy wagon, and specifically one that was accessible because everybody in the foreground, the protesters, are all disabled people, specifically with physical disabilities. And you have a variety of races and genders of folks who are in this photo, and most of the photos that exist are black and white, but this was only in the 1990s. The choice for black and white, I'm not sure why it was made, but finding color photos of a lot of these events, even in the 70s, 80s, 90s, is difficult. And there's, I believe, some intention to that, to make it seem like it was so far ago, when the reality is, I was born in the 90s. It is within a lot of people's memories. And I chose this photo because it really encompasses why the U.S. has the strongest disability rights movement in the world. It is militant, in that it is willing to get in your face and force you to see, hey, this is what things are like. And a lot of that was drawn, again, from the civil rights movement. Now, a lot of the participants, there are a range of disabilities that are represented. Now, there's been a lot of physical disabilities and visible disabilities. Things like mobility disabilities, visual disabilities such as blindness or low vision. Things like deafness, both capital D, participating in the deaf community and deaf culture, and lowercase d, the condition of not being able to hear. This is a movement that is willing to participate, and a lot of which formed around a summer camp up in New York. Go watch CRIP Camp. But it also is an intersectional movement. You have people of all genders, and including ones that are not just man or woman. You have folks who are all sexualities, all races. Even in this photo, we see black people, white people, all sorts of races. And again, it represents the swath of humanity. About a quarter of the US population falls under the ADA's definition of disability. Even wearing glasses or contacts is considered a disability. All of you are welcome at Disability Pride. That intersectionality is important because the 504 sit-ins happened. Now, this is a very famous picture, and you can see the actual footage from this in the CRIP Camp documentary. But I have this here because in this image, we have a lot of those major leaders. From the left to the right, we have Hale Zukas, Ron Washington, the interpreter Lynette Taylor, who is signing, and then Judy Heumann, who is sort of often pointed to as the real sort of head honcho of this, even though CRIP Camp makes it clear that she never saw herself as this. Now, just to describe a little bit more, there is a man in a suit to the left who's sort of lurking there, but we have a white man who uses a device on his head to help move his wheelchair in Hale. Ron Washington is a black man in a wheelchair. Lynette looks to be otherwise abled and is signing, and then Judy Heumann is a woman sitting in a wheelchair with glasses. And again, this is from the 504 sit-ins, specifically when they decided to go to DC. Now, CRIP Camp and others really look at the San Francisco protests, and in a lot of ways rightfully so, as the epicenter of the disability rights movement in the US. The 504 sit-ins happened everywhere. Health, education, and welfare had buildings all over the country. You need offices everywhere, especially before the internet, to be able to conduct business in local areas. And the sit-ins were a mass takeover of federal buildings. In fact, the San Francisco one, I believe, still is the longest takeover of a federal building since the Civil War. And while most of them ended up dissipating after a few days, you ended up having less and less, the resistance lingered in San Francisco, in part due to, as we'll talk about specifically in the transit episode, which will come soon, trademark, that direct action was possible due to that organization locally. Now, there were a lot of more traditional attempts to sway policy prior to the sit-ins, right? You had your lobbying, you had going and trying to reach out to your members of Congress. All of these are good ways to do things. And yes, they are one part of the program. The thing about the disability rights movement is that disabled people then and now understand that you can't just assume that writing a letter is going to fix everything. You have to go out and force people to see things, get in their faces, show them what is going on. And that is why they took over buildings. And it's a good thing, right? Nobody was harmed. Everybody who was taking over the building was doing it for a good cause and making that good trouble. Now, the feds tried several ways to end it by basically blockading people in, by more or less keeping food and water out, so on and so forth. And there were a number of attempts to sort of cut out that communication, especially since, at the same time, there was a strike for writers, and it meant that a lot of news agencies weren't necessarily able to show TV shows, and this was basically what the public was interested in that they didn't have to pay writers for, which, as it turns out, ends up helping with a lot of that intersectionality and solidarity. Now, I've defined intersectionality before as looking at those multiple avenues of connection and identity that come together to make someone who they are. Now, I will refer you back to the Pride episode for more on that, but this kind of builds off of the original Crenshaw definition of intersectionality as where different avenues of power come together. Solidarity is a bit of a newer term, and it's somebody who is attempting to fight the good fight, more or less, coming to the aid of somebody fighting a different but related good fight. And that's why I had the Black Panthers a couple slides back, because the 504 sit-ins would not have been possible without direct action by the Black Panthers. Now, in this case, it was giving the protesters at the Health, Education, and Welfare Building food, water, supplies, things that the Black Panthers, and this is taken from the movie, did not have in huge supply for the programs that they were running, their community efforts. But the recognition was there that this is not just a fight for disabled people. It's everybody's fight. Accessibility is a fight for all people. And it led to the sit-ins continuing until right before this image, the decision was made to send people to DC to confront Carter, who actively avoided doing anything on this. I have this listed on the slides as Carter's cowardice, and you can see more of that in the actual CRIP Camp documentary, but avoiding doing anything on the subject of the 504 sit-ins, and specifically strengthening the 504 legislation and regulation, was a cowardly move. It was something that was entirely done because thinking that the actual people you're supposed to work for are less important than somebody with a few extra zeros behind their bank account. That being said, the sit-ins were successful, and the regulations were created to be really quite strong, and strong to this day. But it's never the end. Now, this is another picture from the Capitol crawl situation. And you have a large crowd of people, and in the front are a few people in chairs of a variety of races, ethnicities, ages, genders, etc., and abilities. You also have people using service animals. And there are a number of signs. The two most prominent are "We Shall Overcome," which is sort of cut off by the slideshow. I apologize for that. And "Access is a civil right." Because it is. 504 had limits because it only regulated what the federal government was directly touching. That's a lot of things. But there's also a lot that it didn't directly touch. And so, say, a restaurant didn't have to be accessible. So you have continued organization, state and local work, various protests in places all across the country that, again, we'll look at them more with specific episodes on different areas and different areas of the direct action of the disability rights movement as our celebration of Disability Pride. But that state and local work kept the disability rights movement going. And it pushed for what would become the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was on the table for a long time. It's just that getting just enough people to go for it was always difficult. Until the 90s. Now, this is one of the most famous images of the Capitol crawl. You have a group of people climbing up the steps, or rather crawling up the steps of the U.S. Capitol. There is somebody taking a picture at the top, sort of the middle. Somebody on the top at the right has made it to the top. And in the foreground, there is a black woman and a white, I'm assuming, man, who are both trying to push themselves up the steps. Now, a lot of the organizers for the Capitol crawl were the same people as the 504 sit-ins. And a lot of the disability rights movement really was a continuation, with more and more people coming in from places all over. You had over 1,000 people participating in this particular event. But it was the result of really needing to force the public to see it. And this leads to, in particular, the signing of the ADA that was veto-proof. Now, this was under Bush 1, who really didn't want to sign it, but it was at the point of he had no choice. Now, for those who don't know or aren't in the US, the president has what is known as the veto, which is Latin for I forbid, and is basically what a veto is. It can take a bill and say, no, we're not doing that. Unless 2/3 of both the Senate and the House, which are the two legislative units in the US at the federal level, say, actually, no, your veto doesn't count. It is very hard to get to that veto-proof level. But by basically going in and enforcing that solidarity, you end up with the disability rights movement getting the best disability rights law in the world to this day. Now, that's the thing, right? The ADA Amendments Act ends up coming in 2008 because none of this ever ends. And it's the result of a Supreme Court case, which the ADA Amendments Act was the result of a number of Supreme Court cases that basically had said, well, this is too vague, we want to limit this, we want to turn this back a little bit because it's not in the law, and essentially Congress coming in and saying, that's not what we said. We said disability rights, you are going to enforce disability rights, we're going to clarify those things, that is exactly what we intended for it to do. And this was a result, in no small part, by the lobbying of what became things like the American Alliance of People with Disabilities, or AAPD. I will correct that in the captions if it is association, as I realize after saying it, I might have messed up. But that lobbying in a good way was basically people pushing their voices in these new post-ADA advocacy groups to get things to happen. And on the screen we have, for Montgomery County Parks in Maryland, Disability Pride Outside. Now, I am a certified park and recreation professional, among my other things that I do. The 35th anniversary of the ADA being outside is amazing to me, because again, if you go watch CRIP Camp, it was about being outside. And on the actual logo, it is a Disability Pride flag, starting with the red, yellow, white, blue, and green in sort of a rainbow, with 4 figures, a kid, 2 adults, and a person in a wheelchair, and one of the adults has a prosthetic leg, it looks like. And it says the 35th anniversary of the ADA, which is this year, 2025. This is incredibly important because the work still needs to happen, and it needs to be everywhere that we make as accessible as possible. Now, not everything can be perfectly accessible, but by God, we have to be trying. That said, I wanted to end this, and this has been an angrier episode for a number of reasons that are contextual, some of which are personal, some of which are very, very, very public. There's still things to do. This is a photo from the Philadelphia 2022, I believe, Disability Pride March. And you have a number of people with a variety of disabilities who are in wheelchairs, they are walking, they are wearing a number of different outfits. You have a service animal, you have a black man in the foreground who has a American flag with stars shaped as Blue Bob, the international symbol of accessibility. You have signs. You have the throng of people, disabled people, wearing masks to recognize that immunocompromised people, people who get sick very easily, are disabled people. And the best way to celebrate is to cause good trouble. Go do things that are going to get people's attention, that are going to wake people up to the reality of disabled people being harmed by things going on in the world right now. Bring it up in meetings. Bring it up in meetings with your bosses, with other people in political groups. Push for accessibility. Recognize solidarity. Disability rights are human rights, as are trans rights, as are gay rights, as are black rights, as are every right. We have to be in solidarity with all the people, because anybody can become disabled, no matter who you are. And so that solidarity is incredibly important. And we need to be pushing for it, maintaining it. Now, I have 3 other episodes that I'm going to be doing this month: transit, healthcare, and education. Because these are areas that are currently under attack by essentially fascists. And I'm going to be honest about that. There are a lot of things you can do to push for improvements in these areas. Because the first places that, in almost all of these, people are going to get hurt are disabled people. But right after us, it's going to be other minoritized folks. And trust me when I say, you can make a difference. You just have to be out there, working with your community. I am but one person. I cannot do it all. And for this Disability Pride Month, I'm asking for your help. Go and find places where people are organizing. Reach out to your local Center for Independent Living. Do the things. Be a part of the solution. Don't just sit around and say, wow, there are people who are doing the thing. You too can do it. I guarantee you, everybody in CRIP camp, if you ask them, hey, did you ever think you would be one of the people who made disability rights a thing, not just in the US, but the model for the world? I bet all of them would say, hell no, I would not have thought that, or some variation. And again, we are all part of the solution. Thank you all for watching. I look forward to our next episode, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. A huge shout out to the wonderful people over on Patreon who are helping to make this project happen. As always, we aren't getting any ad revenue from YouTube, and you'll also get your name up on the screen right about now, like these lovely people who have helped support the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our next episode. Unwelcome Access is a production of Autism, a disability and accessibility consulting organization.